To understand the answer, we have to go back to the moment it was spoken, to the hillside where a crowd gathered to hear a teacher unlike any they had ever encountered before. It has been quoted in arguments, posted on social media, and spoken in moments of conflict more times than anyone could count. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 1, where Jesus says these words, "Judge not, that you be not judged." Simple, direct, powerful. But simplicity can sometimes be deceiving, because while the words themselves are clear, the meaning behind them has been misunderstood, misquoted, and misapplied for generations. What did Jesus actually mean when he spoke these words? Was he telling his followers to never evaluate behavior, never speak truth, never recognize right from wrong? Or was he pointing to something far deeper, something that cuts to the very core of the human heart? In modern culture, this verse has become one of the most frequently used responses whenever someone raises a moral concern. Someone points out a harmful behavior, and the immediate reply comes back, "Judge not." Someone expresses a biblical conviction, and the conversation is shut down with those two words as if they were the final authority on the matter. The verse has been turned into a shield, a way of deflecting accountability and avoiding difficult conversations about truth. And while the desire to avoid harsh, self-righteous criticism is understandable, using this verse to argue that all moral evaluation is wrong actually contradicts the very teachings of Jesus himself. Just a few verses later in the same chapter, Jesus tells his followers to watch out for false prophets, to recognize them by their fruit. That requires discernment. That requires evaluation. That requires the ability to look at something and say, "This is not right." So clearly, Jesus was not commanding his followers to abandon all judgment entirely. The misuse of this verse often comes from pulling it out of its context and treating it as a standalone rule rather than part of a larger, richer teaching about the condition of the human heart. This is the heart of the teaching. It is not a prohibition on discernment. It is a call to self-examination before correction, one of the most significant and detailed teachings Jesus ever delivered. He was speaking to a large crowd, addressing the attitudes and inner lives of those who wanted to follow God. The sermon was not a list of external rules. It was a deep examination of the heart. And within that context, Jesus used a vivid and almost humorous image to make his point. He described a person who notices a tiny speck of dust in someone else's eye, a small splinter, barely visible, and rushes over to remove it. But this same person has a plank, a full wooden beam, lodged in their own eye. The image is deliberately exaggerated to make the absurdity clear. How could anyone see clearly enough to help another person when their own vision is so severely obstructed? He was warning against the cold, superior, self-righteous posture of someone who has appointed themselves as the standard by which all others must be measured. The tendency of human beings to hold others to a standard they themselves are not living by. It is one of the most deeply rooted patterns in human nature. We notice flaws in others with remarkable speed and clarity, while remaining almost completely blind to the same flaws, or even greater ones, within ourselves. Jesus was not telling his followers to stop caring about truth. He was not telling them to look the other way when something is genuinely harmful or wrong. He was telling them to approach correction with humility, with honesty, and with a willingness to first look inward. The instruction he gives is not to stop helping others remove the speck from their eye. The sunrise that begins each new day is a reminder of that mercy, fresh and unearned, available to every person who turns toward it. If anything, in an age of constant public commentary and instant opinion, it has found new and more powerful expressions. People are evaluated, condemned, and dismissed in seconds, often by those who have never paused to examine their own lives with the same intensity. The teaching of Jesus cuts directly against this pattern. It asks something harder than simply refraining from criticism. It asks for genuine self-awareness. It asks believers to sit with the uncomfortable question, am I living what I am asking of others? It asks whether the correction being offered comes from a heart of compassion or a heart of pride. Faith, as Jesus described it throughout the Sermon on the Mount, is not a performance. It is not a position of superiority. It is a daily, humble walk that begins with honesty about one's own need for grace. That is the standard Jesus set, and that is the standard he calls every believer to pursue, one honest, grace-filled step at a time. They were meant to redirect the posture of the heart. Jesus was not building a community of people who look the other way at everything. He was building a community of people who look inward first, who take their own spiritual condition seriously before turning their attention outward. That kind of community is marked not by harshness, but by grace, not by condemnation, but by compassion, not by the cold satisfaction of pointing out another person's failure, but by the humble willingness to walk alongside them, knowing that you yourself have needed and still need the same patience and mercy. This is the invitation Jesus extends throughout the Sermon on the Mount, not to a life of moral indifference, but to a life of moral seriousness that begins at home in the quiet of one's own heart before it ever speaks a word to anyone else.